All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monty Sylvan, and I'm the coordinator for the membership department here at AdvaMed. Today, we have a beautiful webinar aligned with you in partnership with Sunrise Labs, entitled CEO Forum, Lessons from the Frontlines of MedTech Innovation. Today, I want you to be mindful of any questions that you may have. Please direct them to the Q&A section on Zoom and not the chat. Any questions that will be in chat that aren't about the webinar, I'll just direct you to the Q&A section. Aside from that, we have a fantastic presentation aligned for you. Opening up today, we have the president of Sunrise Labs, Brian Gilpin. Brian, I'll let you take it over from here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Monty.
Okay.
First off, can everyone hear me okay? Am I good? Okay, good. So first off, it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about today. First off, I've been involved with AdvaMed for pretty much most of my career, and really exciting to do something that helps out with AdvaMed and the community there. And just really excited to present to you three entrepreneurs that I have just a tremendous amount of respect for what they're doing and who they are and how they're going about it. And some of the things that we'll cover, just so you know, before we dive in and have each of them give introductions. Really want to focus this on the journeys that each of these CEOs have had. And they're all at different stages and different types of products and have faced some very big, unique challenges in their own ways. So I want them to talk about that, share their experiences there, share some of the lessons learned to all of you and what it means to be developing innovation at the scale that they're developing it, the type of innovation that they're developing. And then, again, I hope for a constructive dialogue. We'll try to save about 10 minutes at the end for some questions for all of you from the audience. And again, we'll make it from there an interactive dialogue. So with that, maybe I'll open it up to introductions. So for each of the panelists here, if you don't mind, introduce both yourself and your company or most recent company. In some cases, serial entrepreneurs here who are engaged in different activities and have been engaged in other activities. So maybe I ask that we focus on your most recent company. But please tell us about the company, the technology, and then for the audience out there, we'd love to hear how you got to where you are. What was that journey that brought you to being a CEO for an innovative startup technology company? So Jim, maybe I'll start with you.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it. And as you said, it's a journey, right? So the number of steps to get here. My most recent experience, I was a president and CEO of Viterra. We're preclinical spin out of Children's Hospital. We're focused on the extreme preterm babies. And with that, trying to develop, as the FDA would coin it, as an artificial womb technology, which is cutting edge. And again, it's preclinical, multiple discussions with the FDA, and very, very exciting, almost like we defined as a moonshot. So that's my latest experience, and I'm sure we'll talk about my other experiences going forward. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you, Jim. So Mark, maybe we'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Brian, for the invite to join this group. And so let me first talk a little bit about Reprieve Cardiovascular. So I'm the CEO of Reprieve Cardiovascular. It's a clinical stage medtech company pursuing a treatment for acute decompensated heart failure patients. So these are patients that show up in the hospital with volume overload, typically have swelling in the limbs and have a hard time breathing. It's actually the second most common admission for Medicare age patients in the hospital in the US and around the world. And so we are pursuing and just finished a large pilot study in the US and just about to embark upon our pivotal trial. So look forward to sharing more about that journey here in a second. And then personally, before I jumped on the startup journey with Reprieve 3.5 years ago, I actually grew up at Medtronic. I spent 16 years with the large organization, a number of different roles in that time, primarily in either the corporate development group, which was doing mergers and acquisition and venture investing in startups, or in the businesses in sales and marketing roles. The previous 6 years before I jumped into the startup world, I was leading the peripheral vascular organization for the business. So I came from a big company, and now I feel like after almost 4 years in the startup, I can at least represent what it takes to be a entrepreneur on this side of the fence.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Jonathan, maybe we'll turn it over to you next.
Yeah, great. Happy to be here. I'm the CEO of Brightseed. We're a preclinical technology company helping surgeons see what's otherwise invisible in the body. We're specifically addressing the ability to see and assess critical structures and disease tissue in surgery. And we're doing that with a technology called hyperspectral imaging that we kind of turn on its head and use the technology in a sort of a unique way. And actually introduce that optics right into the jaws of surgical devices. So before a surgeon cuts or cauterizes, they know exactly what they're about to interrogate as they go. I started my career a little bit differently, where I grew up actually in academia, researching intraoperative imaging with fluorescence and MR. Took a diversion into intellectual property law and was on my way to becoming a patent litigator at a firm called Fish and Richardson, and actually began to fundraise for Brightseed during my second year in law school, and ended up deferring my law job indefinitely and became an engineer out of school. So a slightly different path for me. And have been at the helm of Brightseed for a number of years since.
Okay, very good, Jonathan. Thank you. So thank you for the background. As you hear, we've got a diverse set of backgrounds from each of the entrepreneurs. One thing I'll say is, so through these paths, whether it be through a Medtronic or Jonathan through your path is medical and legal and so forth, or Jim through a variety of different avenues. One thing when you started as the CEO of the company is I can imagine things may not have always gone as you expected or as you envisioned. There might have been some things that came up that weren't exactly as you expected. What would you say, looking back in the development of the technology and development of the company, were the one or two biggest challenges that you had to face? And then can you talk a little bit about how you address them or how you are addressing them? And maybe I'll start, Mark, with you on that one.
Yeah, sure, Brian. Thank you. So, I think it depends on the stage of the organization that you join, of what you really are going to tackle. So when I joined Reprieve originally 3.5 years ago, we were really wrestling with the fundamental science and physiology of acute heart failure, and truly to understand that is so critical to ultimately developing the right product to address those needs. And so whether that's animal studies, whether that's first in human experiences, really being mindful of the fact that you don't know everything is critical, because when you make assumptions that this is going to work or that's going to cause X, Y, and Z to happen, you always get surprised, at least in my experience in early development. And so I think it's really important that that organizations and companies plan for failure when they're really trying to still understand that fundamental physiology that we're all trying to address. And then once you get it right, or at least you think you get it right, I think then it's really a question of how can you create and rapidly develop the minimum viable product to test that out. And I think that has been both the biggest learning that we've had around how we go approach developing a new technology is to really be focused on that minimal viable, because you're going to find other things along the way that are going to want to divert your attention to, and you really need to stay focused as a small startup company that has limited resources to address those critical things. So I think really coming back to understanding what you're trying to do in terms of meeting the needs of those patients, and then being laser focused on just trying to do enough to prove out what is going to work as you move along the pathway. There's always time to add more later in the development of a program, and it's really hard to know where that line is sometimes. So I think that's been the biggest both opportunity and challenges we've faced so far.
Yeah. Mark, any advice on how to stay focused? That's one thing I think we consistently see when we work with companies from Sunrise. It's sometimes easier said than actually done. And what are some advice that you could give?
Look, I think I don't have all the answers on this, Brian, because it's a constant challenge every single week. And I think it's because of the nature of, most of these organizations, when you're small and a startup, you're focused on, the possibilities. You're focused on what we can do to address, this big unmet need. And you're focused with a lot of engineers, scientists, and clinicians who want to think about all of those things. And so I actually think it is the biggest challenge that most startups face is how do you truly focus on just those few things that are most important. And so, I think our team asks all the time is when do we need to do that, not should we do that? Because when you ask when, you in effect, have prioritization as part of that discussion. It's not we should do this and then everything gets put on a plate. So I think a simple question like when do you think is the right time to add, X or Y or Z from an innovation standpoint, a technology standpoint, and you're even adding different clinical considerations. That I think is probably a more powerful question for us and our teams than it is to say, should we do it or not?
Nice. I love it. Sounds good. Jonathan, what about you at Brightseed? What did you see as some of the biggest challenges you've had to face?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll sort of go back to the beginning because I think it's a little bit unique, but the fundamental foundation for Brightseed sort of started through an academic exercise, right? We were following sort of the biodesign path that had been sort of spelled out by the folks at Stanford, considering an unmet clinical need where there's not necessarily a technology solution, within view. And so I think that now there are a lot of innovators that are thinking about it with sort of that same sort of greenfield perspective, and there are a lot of advantages to that, right? I mean, once you lock in on an unmet clinical need, then you have the ability to pick the best technology, whether that's based on performance, feasibility, cost, manufacturability, intellectual property, right, and freedom to operate, right? So there's a lot of advantages to sort of being able to think about, the right technology for the problem, and importantly, you don't have to worry about translation and negotiating a licensing deal. But there's a key disadvantage, right? There's no technology, and there's no validation that the technology you're going to look at will work specifically for your problem that you have to solve. And so when we started Brightseed, we were thinking about things like laser Doppler, ultrasound, right? A wide range of different technologies. And we iterated on a number of different variations of technologies that could be used to help surgeons identify critical structures. And once we locked in on hyperspectral imaging and diffuse imaging, then we had to go out and convince people to invest in us, right, with the idea that we're going to be able to deliver on that technology, and we had to build the team around it, right? And so the challenge was, you've got to go and raise money with a longer timeline than maybe alternative, teams and companies have, and higher cost. And you still need to balance that you're going to be able to execute and deliver a product within a time frame that made sense. So we sort of mitigated that in a few different ways. We've sort of managed a smaller team, right? We've never had more than 10 full-time employees. We've targeted sort of a mix of non-dilutive grant support. So these SBIRs or Small Business Innovation Research Awards, along with angel funding and eventually venture financing. So we've always had sort of a healthy mix of about 50-50 grant support and investor dollars. And we've now raised over 15 million for the company, but that has helped sort of offset the cost of developing a new technology. And then importantly, thinking about sort of what product development partners exist that would be in it for the long haul that could deliver product at scale, tens of thousands of units per year, but are also able and interested in delivering small prototype batches to help our R&D team. And so one of the first things that we did that was, I think, pretty key to the company was we partnered with a local product development firm that had experience in the minimally invasive surgical space, and aligned our sort of, PhD level researchers with a lot of their, development expertise, so that we had a healthy mix of early stage innovation with being able to deliver a technology that could be a product and a scalable product as well.
Good. Okay. So Jonathan, yeah, you hit on a lot of themes there. Everything from the unique technology to the how to fund it and managing the costs. And we'll definitely want to dive some more into your approach to product development, because you've had some unique challenges there. So Jim, maybe we go over to you. What do you see as your biggest challenges? And maybe I ask that you address it in terms of Vitera. So big program coming out of the of CHOP, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. But also, if there's other examples from your past that you'd like to share, I'd appreciate that as well.
Yeah, no, Brian, thanks again. I mean, this is an exciting area to talk about. And from my experience, having started with Siemens years ago and dealing with a large company, a large structure, and then getting into smaller startups in the oncology, urology space with Galil, which eventually merged with a division of Amersham and then sold to General Electric. You get to see what a large company can do and what a small company can do. And it really comes down to resources and people, right? So you don't want to take, in a small environment, you don't want to take large company processes and procedures and overlay that on top of a small startup. So you have to look at what's practical. I think Mark and Jonathan did an excellent job of summarizing some of the challenges that were in front of them. As when you go from a preclinical to clinical and then go from there and starting with some of the evaluation, but it all starts with the unmet clinical need. So what is it? And in our case, on the Vitera side, it's very, very apparent. It's the extreme preterm baby. And in that environment, it's a very unique problem. When you look at medical devices and you're in the mainstream of surgical devices, adult reimbursements, et cetera, you're dealing with mainstream technology. You get into pediatrics and you get into even what we'll call fetal, you're getting to a smaller addressable market, right? So one has to understand that as a backdrop. However, as I mentioned earlier, this is a moonshot. This is something that is going to revolutionize how infants and preterm babies are treated. The implications aren't just for the immediate technology, but the cascade that could come from it. So we take a step back and we say, what's the unmet clinical need? It's extreme preterm babies. But you look beyond that, and there's a market beyond that. As Mark alluded to earlier, you have to look at what you need to do. What is needed today? What do you need to do? What do you want to do? What do you have to do? And the want to do's are on the shelf. The need to do, have to do are right in front of you. You've got to do them. You have to address them. And in our situation, we're not talking about one product. We're talking about several products within one. It's a symphony of technology. So the complexity is off the scale. And so you have to be able to manage that on a day-to-day basis. And to Mark's comment earlier, expect to fail, you don't know what you don't know, those type of things you discover as you go forward. On the Vitera side, multiply that by 8. It's every different phase. And then as you look at the physiology of the problem, what is the physiology of the problem? You're talking about fetal physiology. You're not talking about neonatal. You're not talking about adults. You're talking about a new field that's now being explored. And so all this is a discovery process. And as you discover more information, you have to have a team that's able to digest that information in a fairly quick process, understand it, not react to it, but respond to it in a manner that anticipates the next effect. And to do that across a whole breadth of different products, it's extremely, extremely challenging. So if you look at, a solution for one product and say, well, this widget isn't seeing through a certain thickness of tissue, okay, we have to make certain adjustments. But in our situation, if we had a part of our component that wasn't acting properly, that then affects the downstream of another component, which then trickles into the software, which is the hub of everything. So again, there's this domino effect, and everybody sees it in their own product lines. So it's very important to focus on what you have to do. The engineers, we all love to create and we all love to build beyond. One of the things I learned from Siemens is that you can easily over-engineer things if you have too much money or too much time. And so that's the challenge that all startups have is you want to run hungry, but you don't want to run out of money. So, and the markets drive that. So the challenges that we have at Viterra are, it's again, extremely promising technology. It's preclinical, as I mentioned before. But there's a hierarchy of decision making that needs to be made in our company or Viterra and any other company. What's the priority? The priority is focused on the unmet clinical need, and that is it. The rest of the stuff you can talk to investors about. You can talk about the roadmap. You can talk about the other available markets, but you have to execute on the near term. Because without executing on near term, there is no long term. So yeah, that's anyway, my feedback on your question.
Yeah, no, that's great, Jim. Thank you. And just maybe on that point, as an engineer, I would love at some point in my career to not have to worry about time or money. That would be the dream job, right? Of course, wouldn't get anything done, but still it would be pretty wonderful environment. But the actual constraints that you face, of course, doing these kind of programs, especially the complexity that you faced at Viterra in particular, was just extreme. So maybe it would be helpful, I think, to expand a little bit from each of you on your approach to product development. Jonathan, maybe I'll start with you because you started to get a little bit into that. And I'd love if you could expand a little further about, so how would you describe the approach that you've taken? What's your strategy there? How are you going about it different? Maybe even if it's gone well, what you might be doing differently, and so forth. Can you expand upon that?
Absolutely. I think that when we started Brightseed, we really thought about sort of what are the crown jewels that we're creating, what creates the value, what's the intellectual property that we can own. And for us, that was really around sort of integrated optics and hardware on the one side, and then the algorithms, the deep learning, the sort of the special sauce that allows us to detect critical structures or disease tissue, right? And so from that perspective, we wanted to own those areas internally. And so we've always had team leads internal to the company that own sort of the hardware, the optics, and the software. We did begin, interestingly, by bringing in a translational researcher, a PhD that had spent time defining clinical opportunities and working with clinical partners to understand how we should prioritize, sort of thinking about what Mark and Jim were emphasizing early on, right? So what's the initial market segment we should approach? What's that initial patient or surgeon, and really understanding sort of what that initial product or technology would need to be, and then how we could test it, right? And then we brought in optical hardware lead, electrical engineering, signal processing leads, and then began to add team members around data collection and processing. So that was really sort of the core team internally. And then we began to look for external partners that could help us to deliver on the product and the implementation of the technology. And, in that case, we were really looking for partners that could scale, and that had sort of lived the product development of the product categories that we were interested in. So we wanted to make sure that we were finding partners on the instrumentation and the software side that had domain expertise, that understood the operating room, and that had in-house support for early stage products that would be able to sort of deliver on sort of iterative development. So, understanding that projects weren't going to be $1 million, they were going to be tens to $100,000 projects, right? But that they would also understand what manufacturing and quality trends exist. So things like cybersecurity, right? Being able to be mindful of what we were building and how it would align with product in the future. So that's how we began to think about sort of how we would sort of divvy up the work internally and externally. And then we've always had sort of an in-house project manager to help work with those external partners to make sure that we were getting the right questions answered and we were providing directionality instead of sort of open questions to our external partners to make sure they were efficient relationships.
Great. So thank you. That's I'm going to come back to you on some more details of the questions and how you thought about those partners, because I think what you described in terms of partners sounds a little bit like the Holy Grail. It's the partners that can have the depth of the technology space that you're in. Hyperspectral space it's not a simple technology, right? Especially the way that you're putting it to use. It's pretty unique. But also be able to develop out all the other components around the product, as well as think about how to scale. So it's a pretty unique combination. So let's get back to that in a moment. Mark, maybe we can go over to you. I'd love to hear some more from your side about what your approach was to developing your technology.
Yeah, Brian, it's building on what Jonathan and Jim have said. I think there's a couple really unique pieces that I just want to touch on. Is that when you're relatively early on, you want to be fast, you want to be nimble, and you have to react to all of the nuances that you're seeing, whether it's in your development program or your clinical program, and you want a team that can support that nimbleness, whether it's all inside or a combination of partners. What I think we're going through right now, though, is this transition, both because the technology has matured, but also the regulatory kind of process that we're going through, getting ready to start a pivotal trial, it becomes much more rigorous in terms of how quickly you can make some of those changes, because you have to follow the processes and the testing, et cetera, to then pass through regulatory hurdles, not just your internal hurdles. And so I think that's a really big change that our team is going through right now, of being as nimble as possible, but also be mindful of how often and when and how we combine innovation to go back through those regulatory processes. So I think that's just a mindset as you go and as the programs advance, something that we're very mindful of taking those innovations and taking those things off the shelf that Jim mentioned, that now we want to work on it, but now we really need to have a product roadmap. When do we want to introduce these things? How are we going to introduce those things? What other innovations are going to be paired with those things? And it's not as simple as it once was 4 years ago for us. And I think then the last thing I'll mention, I think is actually really interesting because of the three companies that we represent, is that I think most innovation is getting smarter. And by smarter, I mean it's involving software. And it's involving algorithm. It's involving, deep learning. And when you think about what we're all doing, hardware is so critical to ensure that we have the capabilities to then leverage the software to continue to improve and enhance upon the therapies and technologies we're developing. And I think, as I think about what's probably the biggest challenge we've faced is software is harder than everybody always thinks it is. So I am full admission, a computer science undergrad. And so we've always talked about how software is hard and it always takes longer than you think. And there's all of the requirements to really do this, especially with medical grade software, where you have to be 100% sure that this is going to work 100% of the time. And so when we think about how critical that component is to, build the hardware that enables us to leverage and update software, and build programs and products that are going to be able to scale in the future with that. I think that's something that I think a lot of companies are wrestling with right now. And I think it's probably, if I was able to go back and just say, you could probably never underestimate how much time and attention the software side of these businesses and these technologies plays a huge role in driving timelines.
Yeah. Okay, Mark, thank you for that. And this is an AdvaMed forum, but I will say that from a Sunrise standpoint, you're singing our music, so I appreciate that. And same with you, Jonathan. On that note, Jim, maybe I'll turn that over to you and to tell us more about Vitera and the approach to the technology development.
Thanks again, Brian. And again, Jonathan and Mark are hitting some really good points. So you talk about product development, but I think we take a step back and keep it in context, right? So if you keep it in context, we are in a regulated industry. So as we look at any product development process, you have to keep that in mind from the word go. So you can't be developing things and not be cognizant of the fact that at the end of the day, this is going to have an impact on person. At the end of the day, you have to get through the FDA. So you have to be cognizant of that every step of the way. I've been associated with the companies, not have driven them, but knew of them, that this whole concept of catch up on the documentation later, that's a dead end, because, you can innovate and do certain things, but if you're not keeping track of it, you're going to wind up in trouble in trying to file. So when it comes to the proper documentation, QMS systems, et cetera, I think in your development process, you need to be very sensitive to the quality aspect of it, right? Because you're in a regulated industry. At the end of the day, it goes into and affects the patient. So you have to early on think about that. There are a lot of companies out there that don't think about that. They don't think about the parts. They don't think about traceability. They don't think about certain things that if you have to catch up to that at the 11th hour, you're going to spend a heck of a lot of more money and you're going to delay your submission. But that also relates to, what Jonathan said before. What do you develop in-house? What is your expertise? We talked about the clinical need. All right. So we talked about that earlier. What's the clinical need? Then you have to define what your resources are and what you can afford to do in-house and what you want to decide to keep in-house. If Mark has comments about software. Software is very important. Is that your expertise or is it on the hardware side? And then it's really finding the right partners, because the right partners will help you in that process. We've been very, very impressed with Sunrise and the work you folks have done with us. And I will not share that with others in the sense of the other companies we've dealt with. In our situation, this program originally, as we were spinning it out, was outsourced. And as you develop this technology and you look at it and you say, well, it's not one product, it's several within one. And the breadth of the challenges, candidly, I would say even Medtronic would have a challenge with, because they're so diverse. And so finding those expertise, as Jonathan said, do you go outside or do you go inside? It's one of the first things you have to decide. What's your core competency? And in this area, as with the three companies have talked about, it's developing a product. It's not scaling manufacturing. It's not, the manufacturing aspect. It's the innovation piece. And that core competency then can be divided down into software, hardware, whatever. And so that you have to decide on where you're going to invest and spend time on. So there is a defined process in product development. If indeed you're going to do stage gate, that's one way to do it. If you're going to do Scrum on the software side, that's another way to do it, or waterfall, whatever. You have to decide which one works for your group and how you want to go forward as you develop some of these things out. And that's a decision early on that you have to think about based on availability of resources and people and expertise. So those are things, in essence, comes down to basic questions again. Resources, which ones can you garner? Are you going to keep it inside? Are you going to keep it? Are you going to go outside with it? From a development process, you're in a regulated industry. And to keep it in context, there are milestones that you need to hit with the FDA, and they internally expect that. So internally, again, if it's going to be stage gate or Scrum or whatever word you want to put to it, that's going to be specific to the situation. So then it's a question of resources, and can you leverage those resources internally or externally? So.
Thank you, Jim. And Maybe hitting on one of your themes on the insource versus outsource. When you chose your partners for outsourcing, that can be fairly tricky, right? And with a complex product like at Vitera and also with the others as well, obviously there's a lot of different partners that you need in order to get this thing done. Can you tell me how you went about choosing the right partners? What did you consider? What were the trade-offs? And maybe if you have a lesson learned or two from that process to
Yeah,
share?
no, we went out to multiple companies in the process, and we did find, I have to say the word process. 30 years ago, I hated the word. Now, I live by because you have to walk through that process. It's a discipline. Replace the word process with a discipline. You go through a discipline steps to be able to vet what you think is best for the company and your interests. And as we looked at our symphony of technologies and broke it down into components, and we said, okay, in this section, where do we want to go? How do we discover who are the experts in this space? Well, first, you want to figure out, do we want to keep that in-house and develop the expertise, or do we want to go outside? So that's the first question. So then you say, okay, we're going outside. Then you have to then do your own homework, and you rely on the experience of some of the folks that you work with, and you also do your own homework and say, okay, now in our company, and I've learned this from the Siemens days, it's people, product, and process. There are basically three things. And so in that process, I always had a rule, we have to have three. You always have to have three. Do not get yourself suckered into, well, they look good, they sound good, we're going to run with them. No, I've always been trained, you got to have three. So we'd go out into that area, be it whatever widget we wanted to focus on, and say, okay, what are the capabilities of them? And we look at their financials. You have to understand, are they stable? Because if you go to a large CMO, they're very financially stable, but are they going to be able to react to your requests? So you look at the financials, you look at the number of people, you look at the project management, you look at the technologies that are similar to yours. In our case, we have disposables, there's also capital equipment. So we certainly don't want to go to a company that specializes in disposables to have them help us with capital equipment. So you have to go into those spaces that make sense and that have expertise in. So you go through your checklist of things and you compare A, B, and C, and then you decide which one is the one that makes sense for you. So there's a discipline you have to go through while you're also, flying the airplane, right? So it's a question of, you got to go out and do these things while you're moving the organization forward. But that discipline is very important. And, the well-known, well-heeled, CMOs out there may not be the best choice for you because although they can scale and do scale, if you're a small group and you're only doing 10 of these a year, and you sit around, okay, this fiscal year, I need 10 of these things because I'm still in the development phase. Well, a large CMO may sit there and say, yeah, we're not even going to bother with that. I mean, you're below our radar screen. So you need to find a company that can do that scaling for you or take it to a certain level. And they're out there. There are a lot of smaller houses that will do smaller batches. There are, and will help you scale to a certain point. And a lot of companies out there will say, no, you're below a certain threshold. We're not interested because they have overhead, they have monies, and they have allocation and resources that they want to deploy. And if you're only going to do 10 of these a year, they're not interested. So you have to vet through that. And it's an extensive experience. I mean, this is not something that you take lightly because you're going to be with this partner for a long period of time, and you want them to be able to do some scaling for you. Not necessarily make thousands and thousands of these, because at some point you may move to a larger CMO to be able to do that where the expertise is there. So I'm babbling a little bit, but there's lots to consider, but it has to be a disciplined process you put in place. The minimum needs to be 3 you put on the table, and you compare and contrast all the strengths and weaknesses, and then you go. And you make a decision and you don't look back.
Yeah. And any lessons learned, Jim, from that? Did it always work? Are there times maybe where some
No, I
things
mean,
that
it
you go
doesn't.
back and do a little differently, or
Yeah, there is. I mean, there are times that you think you've done everything right, and then we call it the honeymoon phase, right? So you're doing this matchmaking, and you're in a honeymoon phase, and everything's honky dory, and then you realize, well, wait a minute, we've got this problem. How do you resolve it? And that problem solving scenario involves the two entities. And I've been in an experience where, that other entity sat there and said, well, I don't know. They go, well, wait a minute. We thought you had that expertise. And so it kind of falters. If, I would say the process we went through, we're pretty good at it. Is it 8 out of 10 we got right? 8 to 9 out? Yeah, great. But you get a goose egg every now and then, or the level of expectation isn't met, or the response time isn't there, right? So you sit there and you say, okay, we need to pivot. We need to make a modification to this widget. I need it done in 30 days. And they're coming back, well, how about 90? No, that doesn't work. And so we come to get into the problem solving phase. And that's where the rubber meets the road. I mean, that's where it really becomes, as I mentioned before, honeymoon phase, everybody's honky-dory, matchmake, that's great. And then you get into the point of, well, the spec is off, or we didn't see this, or we got delayed in this. How can you help us get back on timeline and costs? And again, there are some CMOs out there it's not their problem. It's a cost plus scenario. How do you, when you get into CMO situations, how do you avoid cost overruns? That's by proper planning. That's by spending the time up front to do that. But there's always unforeseens. And then it's the problem solving that both entities get to the table and say, okay, we didn't see that this component within the product would fail. We've got to go get more of it. We've got to modify it. Okay, get it, understand the problem. It's resolvable. Now, how much time and money, all right? And that's the proactiveness of a CMO that sits there and says, hey, heads up, we thought we could do X in time frame, but now it's Y plus Z. What can we do to help you get back? And you don't know that until you're actually in the weeds.
Yeah, we see that over and over again. That ability to work together, that relationship, that partnership, the ability to partner is so important.
Yeah.
Jonathan, what about from your side? How did you go about selecting your partners, and any lessons learned?
Yeah, I mean, I don't need to repeat what Jim just said, because I agree with a lot of that. I think that, when we first are making the decision of whether we're going to own it internally versus looking at outsourcing, I think the key decision point for us is we take a consideration of what our unfair advantage for our product will be in the marketplace. And if it's that key feature, in our case, it's the optical information about tissue, right? It's not the jawed tool per se, but it's that optical sensing, then we own it internally. Otherwise, we'll work with partners on delivering the remainder of that product, and then obviously for scaling and so on, we work with partners. So I think that's the first question that we ask. But then one of the things that we've learned along the way is that you're going to go through that process that Jim talked about. You're going to assemble a request for proposal. You're going to define the knowns and the unknowns, and you're going to be as explicit as possible. But it's really important that you've got clarity on what you need to deliver, as best as you can, so that you're providing a path forward for your partner versus, creating an opportunity that's a broad investigation of a development, right? Because the more you lock it down and spell out what the requirements are, the easier it is to work with that partner. And there's going to be less unknowns to define. There's going to be less risk to take out of the project. And so from our perspective, taking the time to, really assemble a very clear definition of what needs to get done can take a while, because you've got to wrangle with a lot of questions about what your product is and what the requirements are. And you're going to have to go back and talk to your stakeholders and engage with your end users. But the more you can lock that down, the easier the path is when you're working with that partner going forward.
Makes a lot of sense. And Mark, what about for you? Any things, lessons learned on partner selection, or any guidance on how you went about it?
Yeah, I think, look, I'm not going to repeat what Jonathan and Jim, already stated, because those guys hit it on the head. So it's tough to go third here on this one, Brian. But I think there's a couple things that I would want to emphasize. One is that, we ask ourselves, what do we have to be better than anybody in the world at? And those are the things that we automatically try to do ourselves and build the internal capabilities to do that, just like Jonathan mentioned. But everything else should be on the table to potentially outsource. And I think outsource is actually the wrong way. It is the way we're talking about partnership. But one of the things that we've learned along the way is that you really have to have enough skill sets inside so that you can manage the partnerships. You have to have credibility in that, building that program, and the skill sets enough to know to ask the right questions, to understand where is the program at, and not completely abdicate responsibility for that outsourcing partner. It is ultimately our program and our responsibility to get this done on the timelines, the schedule that we state as the owners of the program. And so I think that's really important, to have the skill sets and build the team that way and augment with these partnerships. And I'm sure Jonathan and Jim would agree. I think the other thing that when you are trying to be capital efficient, sometimes partners are more expensive. But you really have to balance. I always think every day that I'm delayed is $25,000 that I just burned and set on fire. So when we really talk about burn rates, and we really talk about how important it is to stay on these schedules and timelines, imparting that on my team and then having my team impart that on our partners is critically important. Having people that understand the goals and what we're trying to do overall as a company. And I would say the last thing that is really important is, I want to build a team that's going to be there for the long haul. And so we do need certain skill sets, et cetera, at different times in the program. And so we ask ourselves, when we're done with this, whatever effort it is, are we going to actually need that team to stick around? Because the hardest thing for startups is to do is ramping up and down and up and down. And it's hard on the team. It's hard on, to manage. It's hard to always attract the right level of talent for some of those things, especially when they know it may be transient. And so, keeping in mind all of those different factors is just something that I would add in addition to what Jonathan and Jim already said.
Yeah, nicely said. Well done. So guys, I think we're close to time. I do want to throw out there, and maybe I'll open up to the three of you. Do any of you have any based on your experience so far, and not necessarily related to technology development, it can be anything, for all the innovators and entrepreneurs that are out in the audience, any one piece of guidance or advice that you'd throw out there, having gone through all that you've gone through? And again, I'll throw it out to the three of you if any of you have an answer.
I can hop in briefly. I'd say, especially in technology development, you need to get responses to your technology and your MVP, right? So you want to iterate and prototype and get that into stakeholders' hands, especially when it's a surgeon. They're very visual people. But I would say, your feedback, you have to take sort of with a grain of salt. And so I would say what's exciting about Brightseed has been that we created a core value proposition for our end user. And it was both a clinical value proposition to the patient and the surgeon, but also an economic value proposition for the hospital. And that's really turned into our North Star of critical structure detection. And so I think it's important for any entrepreneur to sort of, really think about what their North Star is and how they're going to deliver a value that has a tangible benefit to the patient, but also an economic value to the hospital system, especially in this current environment where profitability is so key to the success of any medical device. And so being able to define that with clarity is very helpful, as you go to get feedback and define that MVP.
Love it. Mark or Jim? You don't have to. So
I can't. I'd be happy to go next. I think, look, I get that question on occasion, and I would say the simple answer is pick a big enough problem. And the reason I say that is that, like, you can kind of probably hear it in most of our voices, is that developing any technology, doing anything, through this long regulatory path, et cetera, there are always challenges. Even in the most straightforward things that you would think, this is going to be the easiest thing for us to execute this part of the program, it's always harder than you think. And so when you think about pick a big enough problem to solve, it makes it easier. One, you can get yourself and your teams passionate about what you're trying to do, and solving that is critical, because then the other folks that want to be either investors or ultimately, as Jonathan mentioned, the stakeholders, to say, this is a big enough problem that I value that to solve it, as well as to fund that problem to get solved in the first place. And so as we all need to have the stakeholders of the patient in mind, the stakeholders of who's going to buy the technology, but also who's going to fund our organizations, it has to be a big enough problem to solve. And I think that's probably the single biggest issue that I see with some entrepreneurs, is they're not trying to solve a big enough problem. They may have the kernel of it, so keep asking, what's the problem behind that problem, to see if it's an even bigger challenge to solve. And so that would be my final advice, because it is a journey in this space. I mean, all of us, there's been no overnight success stories that I've ever known in MedTech. And so it does take, the better part of a decade for most organizations to get from, the genesis of the idea to something on the market. And so pick a big enough problem.
love it. Very nice.
Yeah, so to follow up on that comment, what's the saying? Go big or go home. So, Mark makes a good point there. So there are, one of the challenges we talked about before was the market that, fetal market is very small, literally very small. So it has its complexities, but that's the point. You've got to have an economic solution along with the clinical solution, as Jonathan alluded to, and you got to be a big enough market. All those are things that, you have to have in your formula going forward as you think about what effort you're going to then undertake. Being a CEO, I think, as Elon Musk said, it's like chewing glass and looking into the abyss. You don't know, you've got all the problems in front of you. You've got to deal with all this stuff. Oh, by the way, you need to make a product that's clinically relevant, economically feasible, and it addresses a bigger market. So those are things that you keep in front of you. But from a day-to-day perspective, now this is going to get very personal for people. I've learned through my experience, it's not as bad as you think it is, and it's not as good as you think it is. You've got to be consistent. You have to deliver consistency for your personnel, your investors, every player that you deal with. You have to be consistent in how you present yourself, and you have to take care of yourself. You have to be balanced, and that we all forget about. So lots of things to do on the business side, but at the end of the day, if you're not here tomorrow, what's it worth?
Well said. Well done. Okay, so maybe with that, maybe I'll ask Monty from AdvaMed. So do we open for questions?
Absolutely. So as of now, we only have one question in the queue, but if anyone else would have a question right now for everyone, please feel free to ask it right now. But this was a very thorough presentation, and I think you guys also answered a lot of questions that were popping up in people's heads as they were coming. But the one that I do have is, what would you do differently if you had to do it again? And this is around 12-16 during the time you first were talking about your startups.
Someone want to throw an answer on that one? What would you do differently if you had to do it again?
Well, that's interesting, because they asked the same question to the CEO of NVIDIA. And his response is, would you do it again if you could? And the answer was no. Why? Now, there's a guy who sits on millions of dollars, right? So he's sitting there, why would you do that? Right? And his comment was, it was 1,000 times harder than he thought it would be. And I think what we all do is that we project this thing is going to be in a certain time frame and we're going to get these things done. And that projection, that visualization that we all have, that basically motivates us, is optimistic. And it's great to be an optimist. I welcome that. So the level of expectations, having come back again and say to myself, what have I learned through the process and would I've done it again? Oh, sure. The answer is yeah. I left a big company, went to smaller companies, much more dynamic, much more exciting. But it's also, you need to level your expectations. So anyway.
It's good. Okay. And I think we answered that question kind of throughout the presentation as well. Things we do differently. There's another question, guys, on cost of goods. So how do you balance product COGS and launched timeline? So maybe Mark, we'll start with you since you're kind of at the stage where you're thinking very hard about that, I think.
We are. I think look, I think there's two really fundamentally different things. One is, what's the right product, and can you ultimately get to a cost of goods that's going to make it very viable? And that's not just like, I think I have a plan or whatever. You have to have a plan to be able to get there in relatively short order, by the way, because when you think about a technology adoption, and when you go from making 1,000 to 10,000 a year, you really need to understand how those things are going to scale. And so, that to us is right out of the gate, there will be challenges. You want to make sure you have a great quality product, that meets the needs of the customers, because if you don't do that, then it doesn't matter what your cost of goods sold are. The second thing, though, is developing, and frankly, Brian, we're doing it right now, as you mentioned, is developing a plan that you can implement over the course of a couple of years to really get down to a cost of goods sold that is going to be viable longer term, whether that's our organization as a standalone or somebody else that may own the organization in the future, so that you have credible plays to get there. It's a great question.
All right.
You're on
And
mute, Brian.
one more question is entered. During the initial product configuration process, trying to achieve product market fit, who is at the table to help find the right product permutation for your business goals? Excuse me, permutation.
So who wants to go on that one? Jonathan, maybe that's for you. So who's, as you're developing the product, who do you have at the table trying to figure out what the market need is and how to make sure the product fits that need?
Yeah, I mean, and unfortunately, the market has changed since I think we started Brightseed. So we've obviously we began Brightseed working with surgeon partners at Northwestern Medicine here in Chicago, and we've continued to work with surgeons around the United States to understand workflow and what products are impactful in the operating room at the right time. But today, so much more of the decisions are not even made by senior members of the hospitals themselves, but by larger groups and the heads of supply chain, right? So we're starting to have to think about how consolidation affects purchasing and what OR directors need in order to maintain profit in their ORs. And so we've sort of created a broader group of stakeholders thinking about what we're delivering in this first implementation and what the platform can deliver in time. It's a much bigger tent now, considering the requirements for the product than we had when we started the company. And I think that's a shift that we're seeing.
Makes sense. Okay. So guys, I think we're right at the hour. So with that, we just want to thank Jim, you, Jonathan, Mark. Really appreciate the discussion here, and Monty, to you, to AdvaMed for supporting this and allowing us to hold this forum. I really appreciate the discussion. I think it was fantastic, and thank you very much.
Absolutely. You
Thank
said it
you all.
well. Thank you
Thank
all
you
for
all.
attending, and also thank you all for speaking and providing all this beautiful insight. I want to let everyone know that, or that everyone that remains, that all the recording and information will be available shortly. We will send it out to all registrants. But for now, everyone, take care and have a beautiful day. Thank you.
Thank you, Monty.
Bye now.
Everyone.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.